to assess the teaching work. All these past 3 weeks, we had a strike and a demonstration all over Greece against the crime at Tembi and punish all those who are responsible. The demonstrations and the strikes show that our people have decided to combat against the injustices. And now we will have a new strike in April against the downgrading of education. So we are here back again with the fifth event focusing on modern approaches for education and special education. We have Mr. Douglas Fuchs with us, professor at Vanderbilt University. Coordinator is Mr. Dimitris Anastasiou, an expert in special education, and he has also signed the document in favor of all those teachers combating for upgrading education. Mr. Anastasiou, you've got the floor as coordinator. Thank you very much. I'll be brief. We have limited time, an hour or so. I would like to thank the Greek Primary Teachers Federation, Achilleas, to be the coordinator of this. I would like to underline my support teacher veteran school.
Πολύ λίγα λόγια, very few words about our distinguished speaker today, Professor Douglas Fuchs, who is a research professor at Vanderbilt University and Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research, a highly respected scholar in special education and beyond, education psychology and education policy. He is the author or co-author of more than 500 articles in peer-reviewed journals and 80 book chapters. He has directed over 50 federal research grants, and he's one of the most frequent cited researchers, not only in special education, but also in education and social science. Dr. Fuchs is well known for his contributions to response to intervention, RTI, curriculum-based measurement, CBM, peer-assisted learning strategies, academic interventions in reading and mathematics, along with his wife, Lynn Fuchs, inclusion research and policy and education policy. His commitment to scientific rigor has influenced educators, policymakers, and researchers worldwide, reinforcing the importance of using evidence-based practices to improve student learning. His work on RTI has been particularly influential in transforming how schools in the United States and other countries, not so much in Greece, identify and support students who struggle with learning by emphasizing the role of early and timely intervention, data-driven instruction, and a tiered system of support. At this point, I would like to give a warm welcome to Professor Douglas Fuchs. Doug, we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitris, very much. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. I'm very glad. I'm very glad to be able to speak with you. Next slide.
Just
when I was asked to talk about contemporary approaches to special education in the United States, and there is no way to talk about contemporary approaches for special education in the United States without talking about inclusion. Inclusion is, generally speaking, a policy, philosophy, point of view that that says that all children and youth, kindergarten through 12th grade, should be in the general classroom, either for all of the day or as much of the day as possible. There is such a thing as full inclusion, and advocates of full inclusion who go further and say all children with or without disabilities should be in the general classroom 100% of the time. And that the general classroom can be made strong enough to accommodate all of the special learning needs of all of the children in the school. There are many in the United States who disagree very strongly with this, including many special educators. But I think it's fair to say that for the last several decades, the inclusionists and full inclusionists have been winning this argument, this disagreement, this battle, if you will. And so I wanted to share with you something that is not, I understand, is not well known in Greece. It's a model for general education known in the United States as RTI, which stands for Response to Intervention. It's also known by the letters MTSS, which stands for Multi-Tiered System of Supports. Multi-tiered system of supports. And I'll be using RTI and MTSS interchangeably, although there are differences between them. For purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to get into the details. But RTI and MTSS was created by inclusionists for trying to make general education the place where all students with and without disabilities should be educated. And I want to describe RTI or RTI MTSS to you so you have some general understanding of it. And then I want to explain how or why it's not being used well, and what the challenges are in it, and how most American schools have not been able to meet the challenges posed by RTI. So the objective of this presentation is to provide an overview of RTI, to describe three major challenges when implementing it, some recommendations for addressing the challenges, and I'll stop somewhere around there and look forward to your questions. Next slide, please. So RTI is supposed to bring together, to integrate assessment and intervention in a multi-level prevention system to identify and reduce the risk of poor learning outcomes for children with disabilities and children without disabilities. A strong three-tier RTI model has three tiers that are clearly different from each other, including differences in levels of intensity of instruction. Next slide, please. The first tier, the first level of the RTI model is tier 1. And in tier 1, the hope is that instructional practices that the general education teacher conducts is based on research principles. So the instructional practices, the curricula, the instructional materials, the hope is that the general educator is using these things based on research. A second hope is that accommodations are made by the teacher that permit access to the core or the basic program for all students. A third hope is that strategies to address the students' motivational problems that may interfere with them performing the academic skills they have will also be addressed.
Πρόγραμμα για όλους τους μαθητές. Η τρίτη παραδοχή και ελπίδα είναι ότι η στρατηγική
And finally, classroom routines, that there will be classroom routines that provide modest instructional differentiation. So the assumption with respect to tier 1 in the RTI model is that the core program will be based on research principles, that accommodations will be made so that all students in the classroom, all students with and without disabilities, will have access to, will be able to make use of the core program. And third, that there will be strategies to address students' motivational issues, because many of these children have relatively poor motivation because they have failed to succeed. And the last assumption is that there will be regular routines in the general classroom that will permit the teacher to make modest, that will permit the teacher to make modest changes in the instruction to fit the unique learning needs of all kids. But the teacher's capacity to do, but how to put it, the assumption in tier 1 is that these instructional modifications for each kid will be very modest, will not really require the teacher to do a lot. And then finally, all students in tier 1 are to be screened to identify those with risk for poor academic outcomes. Next slide. So the second tier is secondary prevention. Okay, the first tier is primary prevention. The second tier or level is secondary prevention. For at-risk learners, a second level of prevention is provided. And in theory, in principle, the defining features of the second tier of secondary prevention is that it will include small group intervention with a validated instructional program. There will be specified instructional procedures that will have the necessary duration and frequency to be effective. And this means oftentimes intervention that would last between 10 and 20 weeks, with each session lasting 20 to 45 minutes, 2 to 4 times each week. Another characteristic or feature of the second tier, secondary prevention, is student response is monitored and is classified as either adequate or inadequate. So students are monitored to determine whether their response to intervention is adequate or inadequate. If adequate, the students are to return to primary prevention or tier 1. Next slide, please. And then finally, tertiary prevention or tier 3 is the last tier of RTI as typically understood in the United States. children with inadequate response to Tier 2 instruction move to Tier 3. Tier 3 in the RTI model is supposed to be the most intensive level of intervention offered by teachers in most schools. And its defining features are that there are individual year-end goals on instructional material that match students' needs. Second, a validated instructional platform or a validated instructional program, which may be individualized even before intensive intervention begins. So in other words, Tier 3 is to start with year-end goals for each student, and instruction is to start using a validated, which means research-backed or evidence-based instructional program. And the third defining feature is that progress is monitored during the implementation of the intervention to evaluate student progress, and the student's response to the intervention over a period of weeks, the frequent monitoring of student responsiveness to intervention is used by the teacher at Tier 3 to constantly change the program to try to make the program more effective for the individual student. So those are the defining features of Tier 3. Tier 3 is supposed to be the most intensive form of instruction. It is supposed to be the most individualized instructional program. Okay. Next slide, please. Dimitris, can you hold for 1 minute, please? I've got to do something that will take 1 minute. I apologize for the interruption. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm back. A three-tier. So in this presentation, I'm making three assumptions about an RTI model or RTI system. The first is that an effective three-tier RTI system reflects these three distinctly different kinds of instruction. The second is that intensive intervention serves students with IEPs as well as other students with intensive instructional needs. The third assumption is that intensive intervention is conducted by special educators or other instructional experts. Next slide, please. The presumed advantages of response to intervention are that it provides assistance to at-risk children in a timely fashion. that kids don't have to wait for a sometimes very lengthy assessment process before they are given appropriate services. A second presumed advantage is that it helps is that RTI helps ensure that the student's poor academic performance is not due to poor instruction, because children advance from tier 1 or primary prevention to tier 2, secondary prevention to tier 3, tertiary prevention, based on their response to instruction. And it is maybe the most basic and most important assumption in the RTI model is that instruction at these 3 tiers are relatively effective. In tier 1, that the instruction in tier 1 in the general classroom is generally effective. It's going to be effective for a majority of children. And in tier 2, the instruction, oftentimes small group instruction, is going to benefit a majority of the children at tier 2. And at tier 3, the assumption is that the individualized instruction is going to hopefully be effective for all kids at tier 3. Next slide, please. So the common pitfalls.
Οπότε, όταν σχεδιάζουμε τα επίπεδα, τι κάνουμε? Τις περισσότερες φορές στο επίπεδο 1 έχουμε μια κακής ποιότητας διδασκαλία. Στο δεύτερο επίπεδο, και όταν λέω επίπεδο 1, πάντοτε αναφέρομαι σε διδασκαλία μέσα στη γενική τάξη και το δάσκαλο, σε αυτό το περιβάλλον, με ή χωρίς βοήθεια από το δάσκαλο. Το δεύτερο πρόβλημα λοιπόν είναι ότι όταν στο επίπεδο 1 δεν υπάρχει αποτελεσματικότητα, δεν υποστηρίζεται η πλειονότητα των μαθητών, τότε έχουμε πολλούς από αυτή την τάξη και από άλλες όμως που μετακινούνται στο επίπεδο 2. Και αυτά τα ονομάζουμε τα παιδιά ως ψευδοθετικά, δηλαδή μη ορθά υποτίθεται ότι δεν προχωράνε στην εκπαίδευσή τους, ενώ επί της ουσίας δεν τα πάνε καλά, διότι η διδασκαλία που τους δίδεται είναι κακής ποιότητας. Και τέλος, ένα άλλο πρόβλημα με το μοντέλο αυτό είναι, το οποίο υλοποιείται συχνά στις ΗΠΑ, είναι ότι δεν υπάρχει ουσιαστική διάκριση στα περισσότερα σχολεία, δηλαδή που χρησιμοποιείται το πολυεπίπεδο αυτό σύστημα, δεν γίνεται διάκριση μεταξύ της βαθμίδας 2 και 3, των 2 επιπέδων. Επόμενη διαφάνεια παρακαλώ. Οπότε, όπως είπα, το πρώτο πρόβλημα με το σύστημα αυτό είναι η κακή διδασκαλία στο επίπεδο 1 ή στη γενική τάξη, γενικά με το πρόγραμμα διδασκαλίας. Η επόμενη διαφάνεια παρακαλώ. Αυτό είναι ένα πραγματικό πρόβλημα, διότι, όπως είπα, η διδασκαλία στο επίπεδο 1, η κακή διδασκαλία δηλαδή, αυξάνει τον αριθμό των μαθητών που ζητάνε, που απευθύνονται στην βαθμίδα 2 και υπάρχει δυνατότητα παρέμβασης. Και εκεί θα δούμε τι διασφαλίζουμε, δηλαδή αν πραγματικά μικραίνει το πλήθος των μαθητών, ποια είναι η ποιότητα των καθηγητών που διδάσκουν κτλ. Αν χρησιμοποιείται η μέθοδος αυτή και δεν υπάρχει μια ισχυρή βαθμίδα επίπεδο 1 στην τάξη, τότε δεν πρόκειται να φέρει αποτελέσματα η συγκεκριμένη μέθοδος, στο RTI. Υπάρχει και αυτό που ονομάζουμε συμπληρωματική διδασκαλία, η οποία σχεδιάστηκε για να υλοποιείται στο επίπεδο 1 από τους γενικούς δάσκαλους. Μία από τις προσεγγίσεις που αναπτύξαμε και υλοποιήσαμε σε πολλά σχολεία ονομάζεται
So supplementary instruction can be helpful in tier one. Unfortunately, most schools do not avail themselves of supplementary instruction. Let's skip the next slide and let's go to pitfall number 2. I mentioned earlier that if we have many students failing, not responding appropriately to tier 1 instruction, then too many of them are identified incorrectly as at-risk learners and are sent to tier 2. Next slide, please. I think all right. So the way that we have proposed to schools throughout the United States to all right, let's skip this slide in the interest of time. Let's move to pitfall number 3. Dimitris, please. Pitfall number 3, failing to meaningfully distinguish tier 2 from tier 3, the most intensive form of instruction. Next slide. So failing to meaningfully distinguish tier 2 from tier 3. When schools do not have a tier 3 that is different from tier 2, it's a real problem because students in need of tier 3 instruction fall further and further behind when they stay in tier 2. Many schools say they have 3 tiers of instruction, but they can only organize themselves at best to have 2 tiers, tier 1 and tier 2. And what happens is that many children move from tier 1 to tier 2 and then stay at tier 2 for months, even though they are failing to make adequate progress. These students who are failing to make adequate progress at tier 2 require a clinical approach to instruction that's conducted by specialized teachers, instructional experts, and people who know how to use data to determine whether and when to change the instruction for these children to ensure that they make adequate progress. Next slide. So pitfall number 3, failing to meaningfully distinguish tier 2 from tier 3. We recommend reserving intensive intervention for students who prove unresponsive to tier 2. And we expect that if a school has an effective tier 1 and an effective tier 2, then only 5 to 7% of the school population would require tier 3. We also recommend that special educators be trained to conduct the intensive intervention system. So other personnel in a school building can work on other parts or other components of the responsiveness to intervention model. And we recommend relying on research-based, data-based individualization to structure intensive intervention. Data-based individualization is a topic that I can't get too much into, but it is a well-researched it is a well-researched approach to provide students with the most serious learning problems effective instruction. And hopefully, you can find it if you're interested in it. Very briefly, data-based individualization. People who used data-based individualization set ambitious goals for their students. They begin the process with a research, with an evidence-based instructional program, and they use that program to try to teach the students. They collect progress monitoring data every week, and they look at the data across time. And when the students' data reveal inadequate progress for meeting specific year-end goals for that student, the instructor adapts the instructional program to try to make it more, to try to tailor it, to try to make it more meaningful and effective for the student and her or his unique needs. Okay, we're going to skip the graph for Kelsey, and we're going to go to the second to last slide, Dimitris. It's RTI/MTSS, rises or falls on the quality of instruction. Why instruction must be generally effective for disability identification. Let's see, what I'm trying to say here is that, and I've said this before, response to intervention absolutely requires that the instruction provided at each of the tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, is effective, or at least is effective for most kids. And when it's not effective for most kids, then the RTI model cannot work. And in the last slide, I asked the question, can schools achieve RTI or RTI MTSS? And my experience is that most schools in the United States right now cannot achieve RTI MTSS. And there is a well-known national study of RTI MTSS schools across the United States. The study involved 146 RTI MTSS schools across the United States in 13 states. And long story short, the bottom line is that almost all of these schools failed to implement RTI MTSS, and the students did not profit from RTI MTSS. So, what do I make of all of this? I'm trying to, very quickly explain to you what is arguably the most popular, quote unquote, inclusionary model in the United States, RTI MTSS. And I've tried to give you some, defining features. I've tried to characterize the model for you so you generally understand the approach. And my explanation of it is that it is very complicated for a school building to implement, not just the general classroom anymore, but three tiers of general education instruction. And all these tiers have to be implemented correctly, and they have to be coordinated with each other. And not only does instruction have to occur, but data collection has to occur. And instruction has to be modified in light of the data that are being collected. All of this is very, very complicated, and I would say too complicated for most schools. And in the meantime, special education has been pushed to the side. because the assumption is that RTI MTSS will be sufficient. If it's implemented well, it will be sufficient, and very, very few students will require special education. So I think I'm going to stop there, and if people have questions, I'd be happy to try to respond.
Συγγνώμη, κύριε Αναστασίου, το μικρόφωνο πρέπει να ανοίξετε.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes.
Thank you very much for that insightful presentation of the issues and controversies surrounding special education and RTI, response to intervention. We now have some time for questions from the audience. I will proceed with the first question. There is a big debate going on worldwide about whether all students with disabilities can and should be included in the general classroom. I think you have already discussed this. Is this achievable? If implemented, what would be the results for students with disabilities? What would be the long-term consequences? And what would change in the role of teacher? I guess special education teacher and general education teacher. Dr. Fuchs, Professor Fuchs, what are your thoughts on this issue?
I think it's very clear that a large number, and of course I'm talking just about the United States, okay, not children and youth in other countries, but in the United States, I think a pretty large number of students with disabilities can and should be taught in the general classroom, but by no means all. I can't give you a percentage, that would be impossible to do, but there is a very large number of students with disabilities who, if deprived of their appropriate special education services and maintained in general education, will fail and will continue to fail. And we have evidence of this. Students with disabilities' performance on national academic tests tend to be very poor, very poor. And they should not be anywhere near as poor as they are. So there are certainly some students with disabilities who belong in general ed and who will do well in general ed. But there are many, many children who need special services, and some of those special services require settings and circumstances beyond the classroom. If we want these children to succeed after school, in terms of work, in terms of health, in terms of having families and being productive citizens, they need a meaningful education, and many students with disabilities will not get a meaningful education in the general classroom.
Thank you very much. There is a second question. Can the use of assistive technology be considered essential for the effective implementation of inclusive practices like RTI? And can RTI contribute to improve both academic performance and communication skills in students with multiple disabilities?
Okay, so I am not an expert on assistive technology. I know generally what it is, and I have seen how it can be applied. And I think assistive technology can be of great help to some number of students with disabilities. No question about it. Can be of great assistance. But it's not the answer for a lot of kids. Assistive technology, we don't have the assistive technology yet to help, to meaningfully help a student, for example, who is severely dyslexic, who is a fourth grade child who does well in math, but who cannot, uh, read simple words. Now, assistive technology might, someone might say, well, you could use assistive technology not necessarily to help them read, but the technology can read for the child, and explain for the to the child what the text is meant to say, but it's not helping the child learn to read by herself. So I think we would all agree assistive technology is very good. It's a real benefit, but it has its limitations.
The next question is about the practical implementation of response to intervention in another context other than United States. The proposal you outline may face challenges in being implemented within the Greek education system because general schools in Greece have very few school psychologists and specialists for children with disabilities. Moreover, when response at the second tier depends on the resources available within the education system, these resources are relatively scarce or low, not so available, and this may become for RTI to be difficult to be implemented.
Yes, so I think I understand most of this. Resources, the lack of resources, broadly defined, is a huge problem. And when I say inadequate or lack of resources, I'm also including special educators who, in many places in the United States, are no longer taught to be instructional experts. Once upon a time, special educators in this country were taught to be the most knowledgeable instructors in their school buildings. And that changed with inclusion. They were taught instead to be inclusionists, which meant to work as co-teachers with general educators in general classrooms, and to focus on not on actually teaching students, not actually working with them intensely, but rather to provide accommodations of various kinds. And so the special education teacher workforce in the United States has changed in terms of the skills that they're coming out of their training with. And that's a very sad thing to see. There are still instructional, special educators who are instructional experts, but many fewer than there used to be.
Okay, the following question, how do you think the education of children with learning disabilities and disabilities in general, I guess, should be redefined to make inclusion a meaningful process? Is that possible?
I do not think so. I do not think so. I think that learning disability, if we can agree that learning disabilities should be properly understood as a label to be given children and youth with very serious learning problems who are not intellectually disabled. If they have very serious learning problems and they are not intellectually disabled. If they are children, in other words, for whom we have, pretty ambitious academic goals, and they are not coming close to meeting those goals because of serious learning problems, then what those children need, and research has demonstrated this. This is not a belief of mine. It is a fact. What these children need is something that we call these days the science of reading. We need teachers who can apply the science of reading and the science of math in most intensive forms to help these kids. These kids need instructional help for 2 and 3 hours a day. And they don't get that kind of intensive instruction in a general classroom. They get it, maybe if they get it at all, they'll get it in a special classroom, in a special school, somewhere other than the general classroom.
Okay, thank you. What digital tools are available to help students with disabilities and special educational needs improve their written expression, including spelling and how students organize their thoughts?
Yes, yes. Writing, written expression is extremely important. It's oftentimes very poor among students with dyslexia or students with various forms of learning disabilities. And again, we need intensive intervention. And there are programs, at least in the United States, there are very, very good instructional programs that have been developed for these children. And it requires it requires instructional expertise, and it requires the opportunity to engage these students, to help these students intensely over a long period of time.
The following question, I think, is coming from a new early career teacher. She asks for advice regarding a 9-year-old student who has been identified with, as he says, cognitive immaturity, perhaps intellectual disability, and attention difficulties. She, the teacher, and her male student are working on first grade material. She helps him write phonetically simple 2-syllable words. However, after writing the first syllable, the student struggles to focus on the second syllable without assistance. I guess it's a word memory issue here. The student also confuses certain letters and has difficulty in math, as he cannot count forward from a given number, for instance, from 3 onward, but he needs to start from 1 each time. She says that this is her first year teaching in a school, and she finds it very hard to know when to encourage him to keep going and when to give him a break. Because her students get tired easily, and sometimes he can't keep going. She would appreciate any advice on how to handle this.
Well, okay, I appreciate that very detailed description of a child who obviously needs a lot of instructional attention and help. Two things come to mind. One is, as a young teacher, it would be really important for her to try to find a mentor, someone who is more experienced, who might be able to talk with her about these things. The second general piece of advice is that in our own work with children with serious learning problems, we oftentimes deal with kids who don't want to work, or they don't want to work hard, and they don't want to work hard not because they're lazy. It's not that they're lazy. It's that they have tried hard before and they have failed, and they're tired of failing. And so part of the instructional process for a lot of these students is to try to gain their trust that together, you, the teacher, and the student will work hard together and toward success. That you're not going to abandon the child, you're going to be there to support the child and to work with the child and to find a way to help him or to help her. So we don't oftentimes talk about the instructional process as requiring trust, but it's definitely part of the process.
Okay. We have two questions more. The first is, I would say, is a comment about autism and set boundaries. Do we need to set boundaries differently for individuals with autism spectrum disorder? Would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I am not I am not an expert on autism spectrum disorders. Boundaries are very important for all kids, even for kids without disabilities. I mean, for those of you who are parents of kids, I mean, all parents know that boundaries need to be set. For children on the spectrum, those boundaries might be even more important because sometimes boundaries protect them from danger and harm. Sometimes they forget the boundaries that have been set frequently before. So boundary setting may be very different for some kids on the spectrum. But yeah, boundaries are really important, and how we implement the boundaries will vary from student to student. I know that for sure. That's about all I can say about it.
Okay, thank you. The last question, and it's a more political question about the current political situation in the United States.
Sure.
Is it true that the Trump administration wants to abolish public schools? Probably, I don't know if it is public schools or Department of Education, but this is the question. If Donald Trump, the president, wants to abolish public schools, do children with special educational needs and disabilities in the United States will attend public school in the future?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I will tell you something. Now, this is a belief of mine. Although there is evidence for this. You will know that there are two major political parties in the United States, Republicans and Democrats. And I will say that for the last 10 years, Republicans, so this is before Trump, well before Trump, Republicans have tried very hard in Republican-controlled states to diminish, if not eliminate, public education. It's not a secret. It's something that many of us see lots of evidence of. They want to, quote unquote, privatize. They want to privatize or make private all education, K-12 education in this country. And they have done this in a lot of ways. And one of the ways they've done it is to starve public school systems of monies that should rightfully be coming to the school systems. And they starve the school systems in various ways that I can't get into. But it's a very, very serious issue. And the question about what will happen if the Republicans are successful in starving the public schools and closing public schools, what will happen to to our most vulnerable students, including students with disabilities, students at risk for other reasons, including poverty. What will happen to these students in that circumstance? We don't know. We don't know. But it's a very scary situation, and it predates Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is supportive of what's been going on, but it started well before Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe Dimitris will all come to Greece.
Yeah.
All of the good people will come to Greece.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Fuchs, under the best conditions, I would say. We hope you enjoyed the experience as much as we did. Again, thank you very much for your time and for your sharing your expertise with us.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you, and good luck to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Keep up the good work.
You too.
Θα ευχαριστήσουμε και εμείς με τη σειρά μας τον κύριο Fuchs, τον κύριο Αναστασίου.
We would like to thank Mr. Fuchs, Mr. Anastasiou for their precious presence here today with us. A lot of the things that have been already mentioned is something that we experience in Greece as well. So the example of the United States is not something that exclusively concerns the United States with regard to inclusion under funding that leads special education to difficulties. We'd like to thank the participants, and we'll be back on the 30th of March, focusing on school committees. It is a round table in which we will invite mayor who will share with us their experience in this sensitive sector. Thank you all very much for attending this meeting.
Ευχαριστούμε.
Καλό βράδυ.
Καλή συνέχεια, καλό βράδυ.
Καλό βράδυ σε όλους. Καλό βράδυ. Γεια. Τι λέει.